In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of the integumentary system, in this case discussing the dermis, the hypodermis, and then also covering other types of damage that might occur to this area of the body. We're going to go ahead and draw a rectangle here. This time we won't make it three-dimensional. We want to introduce you to the different layers. Of course, we start off with the epidermis, which we already covered in the previous video. You'll see those little papillae sticking up into it, extending up from the dermis. Let's go ahead and label the dermis. Now I'm going to go ahead and draw fat globules, which generally speaking will underlie the lower part of the dermis, and this is going to be called the hypodermis. Sometimes it's called the subcutaneous tissue or simply the subcute. It also can be called the superficial fascia. I like to call it the hypodermis because then it's in agreement with epidermis, dermis, hypodermis. Epi meaning above and hypo meaning below in this case. The dermis itself is split into two parts. The upper, about 20% of it, is called the papillary layer. You see I called it the areolar layer here. It's made of areolar connective tissue, but it's actually called the papillary layer because of those papillae. The lower, about 4/5, the more deep lower 4/5 of the dermis is called the reticular layer. It's made of dense, irregular connective tissue. It's basically the equivalent of leather in other animals, very thick and tough. Deep to the hypodermis is usually a layer of skeletal muscle tissue, these red stripes portraying that. Well, we've gotten the layers of the skin sorted out, and this would be a good time to start covering the different types of burns. Now, a burn is any kind of damage due to heat, radiation, electricity, abrasion, friction. What these types of damage have in common is that they tend to be kind of widespread and then of different types of depth, and both of those factors will be considered when deciding how to treat the burn. Now, I've seen this described differently in different sources. The different depths may be defined differently, but I thought I'd go with the simplest type of definition. If you have a burn that extends only into the epidermis, it's considered a first degree or superficial burn. Oftentimes, this would be a typical sunburn, just a bit of redness on the surface. If it extends into the dermis, generally, it's going to be a second degree or partial thickness burn. Oftentimes, this type of burn is characterized by having blisters present on the surface. And then if it extends all the way into the hypodermis, this is considered a third degree or full thickness burn. Now, a third degree burn is so damaging that it actually oftentimes is not painful because the sensory nerve endings have been burned off, so you can poke it and it won't hurt. Oftentimes this might have a charred or blackened appearance. Oof. So let's go ahead and cordon off this section of the page for just discussing burns, just to make sure we're understanding, we're staying on topic here. When we talk about second degree or third degree burns, oftentimes they have to be treated at a burn center. And the reason for that is that sometimes those types of burns are so damaging that they can actually be life-threatening. First of all, it's quite painful, so you might have to get your pain treated. But additionally, you might be losing fluids to the point by day 2 or even by the end of day 1, you might be losing fluids and proteins to the point and electrolytes to the point where you're actually at risk of becoming dehydrated. So that is something that will happen at a burn center, is they'll start to replenish fluids into your body. Another thing they will watch for is infection, especially by day 2. By day 3, they're going to be starting to look for infections. They oftentimes now will cover the wound with some kind of, actually they'll use something like fish scales to cover the wound. It keeps any risk of infection away. And it kind of gives you sort of a temporary second skin, or they'll cover it with some kind of silicone in order to mitigate that risk as well. So these are the kinds of things we'll be looking at in a burn center. But the question is, when do you send somebody to a burn center? When is it appropriate to treat a burn at a burn center as opposed to simply treating it at home? Well, the answer is that it probably depends on the health practitioner. Some would say any third-degree burn should immediately go to a burn center, but the rule of thumb is about 10% of your body. If 10% of your body it has a third-degree burn, then you would go to a burn center. If 25% of your body had a second-degree burn, you would go to a burn center. And the question is, where do those percentages actually come from? And this is where we turn to the rule of nines with my beautiful, beautiful people that I drew here. Oh, I can't believe I'm going to make this public. I've never been able to draw the outline of people. Isn't that weird? All right, so what we're doing is we're dividing up the body into sections. You can see that I've sectioned off. I have a posterior and an anterior person here. I've portioned off the head and neck, the thoracic region, the abdominopelvic region, both arms, both legs, and in fact, the pelvic region or the groin in just the anterior surface. And what I'm going to start to do is assign numbers into each of these. So the anterior of the head and neck, 4.5%. The posterior of the head and neck, 4.5%. The anterior of the thoracic region, 9%. The posterior of the thoracic region, 9%. The anterior of each arm, 4.5%. The posterior of each arm, 4.5%. That means that each arm has a total percentage of 9%. So if you were burned from the shoulder down, only the left arm, then that would be 9%. We turn to the abdominal region, 9% in the front, the anterior, 9% in the posterior, 1% for the inguinal region. If you haven't already done so, go ahead and look up hot coffee. It is free on YouTube as of this publication. Lastly, we have each leg. The legs are fairly a fair amount of skin, so 9% in the anterior of each leg, 9% in the posterior of each leg. Therefore, each leg is a total of 18%, and both legs are a total of 36%. So that's the rule of nines. We're going to be switching topics to the concept of blisters, which is an interesting one. It gives us a little peek into the details of exactly how the epidermis is put together and how it interacts with the dermis. So here we're drawing a super close-up version of the epidermis with just that little papillary, the papillae sticking up into it. This time we're going to go ahead and draw some blood vessels. It turns out there are tiny little venules in blue and arterioles in red, just deep to the epidermis. As I suggested in the last video, the epidermis is completely avascular, no blood supply, but it does have access to nutrients, oxygen, and the ability to get rid of its waste products and take on hormones and things like that through the blood supply that's right there. So that's actually the major purpose of the blood vessels that underlie that epidermis, is to make sure that those very vibrant living cells, those metabolic mitotic cells, especially the ones in the stratum basale, have the ability to actually survive. They do not have their own blood supply, but they can access blood from these blood vessels just deep to them. So I went ahead and drew in orange a shorthand of all those cells that we drew in the prior video, and this time I'm filling in some fluids. This is going to be interstitial fluid. I'm kind of drawing it in aqua color. So there's your interstitial fluid. It's not blood, but it's fluid that allows for the, you have to be able to bring stuff in and out, and that generally speaking requires a fluid. So there's going to be, although there are many, many tightly knit together cells in the epidermis, there's also going to be some interstitial fluid kind of flowing between them. So that if you have any kind of an abrasion, say on the back of your heel from wearing a shoe that's a little bit too tight, or from using lawn clippers for the first time in a long time and that nice soft skin of your hand is not yet calloused, you may develop a blister. What a blister is a separation of the layers of the epidermis, just as shown here. And what happens is that interstitial fluid actually flows into the region and kind of separates the layers of cells away from each other. And so that's what a blister is. And there may be some white blood cells in that area as well to mitigate infection. Now, a blood blister is a little bit different. If you have a blood blister, what we know about a blood blister is that it's going to have blood in it. Remember that the epidermis is avascular. So if you have a blood blister, that means that you've actually damaged a portion of the dermis as well, because that is where your blood supply is. So generally speaking, it's going to be that papillary layer of the dermis, just the very most superficial part. The blood vessels are right there. So if you get damage into that region, then some of those blood vessels may very well become damaged and some blood will start to leach out. Moving right along, we're going to draw the sudoriferous glands, which I'm going to be drawing them in isolation first because I find this, and then just kind of draw the skin around them. I find this is the easiest way to draw them rather than drawing the skin first and trying to fit them in there. So that's why I'll be drawing them by themselves first. All right, the sudoriferous glands include eccrine glands, which are widely distributed all over your body. There's about 3 to 4 million of them. Your typical sweat glands. They secrete sweat, which is mostly water, slightly acidic, a pH of maybe 5 or 6. Any number under 7 is going to be acidic. And the reason it's acidic is because it actually contains some acid waste products such as uric acid. It'll also contain salts. There's a substance called dermicidin in sweat, which is a natural antibacterial substance. It turns out there are literally trillions of bacteria on the surface of your skin, and this is one of the ways that your body makes sure that they kind of stay in check. So those are the eccrine glands, your typical sweat glands. Now the apocrine glands, very similar structurally. However, there's 2 differences here. The apocrine glands are only found in the axillary and anogenital areas, so your armpits and your groin. And the sweat here is just the same, except that it also has proteins and lipids. Turns out that bacteria are really attracted to proteins and lipids. They'll start to actually consume those, and they will release a byproduct that is smelly. So your body odor is actually not caused by the sweat that your body is producing, but rather by the particular type of sweat in these areas and the bacteria consuming it. For this lesson, I want to make these chunks of skin actually 3-dimensional, make them kind of tall, make sure you put plenty of room underneath of there because there's a bunch of structures we actually need to draw underneath of there. I made this top box a little bit too short, so we're just going to ignore that line. Go ahead and draw our box in there. Lots of room at the bottom, remember, below the sudoriferous gland. And what I'm going to draw here is the pore up at the top at the surface of the skin. And what you'll see is that you have 5 pores on that portion of the skin, 2 of them from the eccrine glands that we actually drew, and then 3 of them from ones that are in other areas that we're not actually drawing, but you can still kind of see their pore. So there will be a duct, and then there will be a pore that actually opens to the surface of the body. And of course, the eccrine gland itself, the sudoriferous glands themselves have kind of a sinusoidy look to them, as you see. Some quick wavy lines to indicate the epidermis way up at the superficial layer there. And now we're going all the way down to the deep layer. We haven't yet hit the hypodermis. We're still in the dermis. At the deepmost level of the reticular layer of the dermis, you are going to have some blood vessels. Now, the blood vessels I'm drawing here, just red and blue, so blue for venules, red for arterioles. And I'm just drawing 2 simple ones. I'm keeping them quite thin on this side. I'm going to draw them differently in the other cube, but in this one we're going to go ahead and draw them thin and kind of weak looking, very light. And you'll notice that there are some that are deep, and then there are some venules and arterioles that shoot straight up vertically through the dermis, and they're going to be connecting to superficial blood vessels. Now, we already drew these up above where we drew the blisters, so you already know that just deep to the basal layer of the epidermis, the stratum basale, just at that apicalmost layer of the papillary layer of the dermis, we have some blood vessels there, some arterioles and venules. I'm going to go ahead and add in a nerve fiber as well. I'm drawing in kind of like a bright green color. Normally these are portrayed in yellow, but I don't think the yellow was showing up very well, so I went ahead and also I was using it for the fat globules in the hypodermis, so I thought it would be better to use a different color for those reasons. And you'll notice that the nerve fiber extends up into and it actually connects with the sudoriferous glands. Right, when we look at this other cube here, we're going to be drawing everything a lot thicker. So thicker venules, thicker arterioles, we're going to be drawing them just the same. It's almost like we're drawing two versions of the same cube. If I had the artistry to actually draw things identically, that's what they would be. But anyway, very thick arterioles, very thick venules, and what we're indicating is, on the left-hand side, this is an area of the skin that is cool or cold, and we're trying to preserve the heat inside of the core of our body. And we have a few different things that we're doing to do that, which I will point out to you. But it becomes much more obvious on the right-hand side when we actually draw what happens to the skin when you're warm and you're actually trying to release some of that heat. So it turns out the core of the body, the brain and the abdominal pelvic region, all of those soft organs must maintain a body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. And anytime it gets too cold or too warm, those adjustments are immediately made. And this system right here, with all of these blood vessels buried all over the surface of your skin, we have the ability to very quickly make adjustments to ensure that we're either releasing too much heat or that we're retaining heat when we are too cold. So on the left-hand side, we're portraying the cold situation. On the right-hand side, we're portraying the warm situation. So when it is warm out, or when it's warm inside of your body for whatever reason, what you'll see is that the blood vessels are dilated or they are opened up more. All of them are. The deep vessels, the venules and arteries going to the venules and arterioles going to the surface, and then the ones that are along the surface as well. Now, we can actually shunt, it's not really shown in this picture per se, but you can kind of imagine this. We can actually shunt blood away from, the entire, for example, the entire arm. If you're wearing a sleeveless shirt and it's cold outside, your body may choose not to send very much blood down the entire arm. So you can actually constrict the blood flow all the way up at the axillary region. You can constrict those blood vessels as well and not send as much blood to an area in the first place, like to wide areas of the body. But here we're showing, of course, a much more local story. We're showing what happens when we either decide we have, on the right-hand side, we have too much heat, we need to release some, we're going to dilate all those vessels, we're going to send a lot of blood to the surface of the skin in order to make sure that it's cooled as much as possible. And we send it straight up to those most superficial layers up there to make sure that we are allowing that blood to cool as it goes along the epidermis. Additionally, these nerve fibers are actually part of the sympathetic nervous system, a branch of the autonomic nervous system, and they will allow for the glandular release of sweat. So that's what I'm portraying kind of in a pink color here. What we call this evaporative cooling, where we take little droplets of sweat and we literally just send them out of the body. And of course, on the left-hand side, none of these things are happening. We've constricted the flow of blood to the dermis itself. We've constricted the flow of blood to the blood vessels at the deep layer, at the apical layer, the superficial layer. And also, the sympathetic nervous system has not allowed for the release of sweat from those sudoriferous glands on the left-hand side. So that's the cold on the left-hand side and the warm on the right hand. One of the last topics tonight is going to be looking at the features of skin that has hair. And so one of the features we're going to be looking at is going to be the sebaceous glands. Notice the spelling. The first thing I'm going to draw in isolation again, and then draw some skin around it, is a hair that is relaxed and another hair that is poking up, straight up. And I'm going to draw what's called an erector pillae muscle attached to each. The one on the left-hand side is going to be an erector pili muscle that is relaxed, and the one on the right-hand side is contracted. I didn't draw it super well, but you can kind of see the bulge in the center there, indicating that it's kind of spindle-shaped on the left-hand side and that it's tighter on the right-hand side. The pulling of this muscle is what actually caused that hair to stand upright, and it also has caused that bump that I just drew there. Just kind of connecting everything. It basically connects to the shaft of the hair follicle, and then it also connects basically to the underside of the epidermis. So this is the erector pili muscle. And on the left-hand side, we have the relaxed version where it has that bulge in the center. And on the right-hand side, we have the contracted version, which causes that hair to pull upright and cause a goose bump. That is what goosebumps are caused by, contraction of the erector pili muscle and the hair standing on end. There's two basic reasons why you would have a goosebump. You're either a little bit too cold, and that muscle contraction causes a little bit of a burst of heat, or it could be an emotional reaction to something, either a great deal of emotional energy and fear or of extreme pleasure. And so I'm drawing these little bunches of grapes here on the other side. Oftentimes they'll actually be associated with the erector pili muscle, but I thought I would just go ahead and draw them separately. These are called sebaceous glands, and they have a substance in there called sebum. Sebum is the oil of your skin, and it's released straight up through the hair shaft and spreads along the surface of the skin. So in hairy areas of your body, you'll tend to have a little bit of oil released on a regular basis by these sebaceous glands, as they are associated usually with hair follicles. Not always, though. You can actually have sebaceous glands that have their own, it's not really a duct per se, but it does not have a hair follicle. So this substance, sebum, is going to be an oil that provides lubrication for the skin, and it also contains a bactericide. Remember that the eccrine glands, the sudoriferous glands, they put out a specific bactericide called dermcidin. The sebum also contains a bactericide, so we always have that ability to fight off all those bacteria that are floating around on the surface there. All right, so I'm going to draw the two most common issues with the sebaceous glands, which would be a closed comedone and an open comedone, oftentimes called a white head and a black head. So to this, oftentimes the hair follicles in this case, or whatever type of follicle this is, we usually don't portray it with hair at this point just to simplify the lesson. There are sebaceous glands attached to it. The sebum is kind of poured into the middle of this. And the reason why we have white heads and black heads, why we have acne, is because there's a few different reasons why it might happen, but it could be an overproduction of sebum. Perhaps you have a lot of oily substances running through your blood. Oftentimes sebum is chock full of triglycerides, for example, so that could come directly from the food that you're consuming. If you have a time period where you are producing a lot of testosterone, you might have a lot of acne at that time. So oftentimes as teenagers are going through puberty, they will have lots of acne because the testosterone tends to increase the activity of the sebum, of the sebaceous glands. And then sometimes there's just like some of those, do you remember the superficial most layer of the epidermis is called the stratum corneum? Those cells are supposed to flake off, but sometimes instead of flaking off, they kind of stick around and sort of trap themselves sort of at the mouth of these vessels. And so it's difficult for the sebum to actually get out where it's supposed to get to. And so you might have sebum that is simply trapped behind. This could lead to a little bit of an inflammation. Oftentimes there will be white blood cells as part of this because it technically is inflamed tissue, and it's kind of like they're fighting off a very minor infection in this area that could potentially become a much greater infection. The open comedone has a black appearance because it is open to air, and therefore dust from the air and dust from the surface of the skin starts to mix with all of the fluids and oils and white blood cells in this area, and it takes on a black coloration. The white head remains white. The closed comedone is closed at the top. There's actually a layer of the stratum corneum grown over it, and so it's actually protected from that dirt. However, the infections oftentimes on closed comedones can be more intensive because all of those oils are trapped.